For now, the pundits say it's pretty simple. They say that this is a president who's governed as a partisan, presided over a deteriorating economy, and bungled a war in two fronts. Ironically, these conclusions suffer from the same flaws the critics say they see in the president. They're too lazy, they're too simple, and they're too lacking in nuance. And to be sure, the Bush record will be mixed, but the portrait that will eventually emerge over years, I suspect, might look different than that. And we'll have to see how it plays out. But I think if there was a phrase I could use to describe what's been missing from the analysis so far, most of the analysis of the president thus far has focused on the content of his decisions rather than the context. And I think over the next 30 or 40 or 50 years, you're going to begin to see historians debate the context more and more. And obviously the Bush defenders will push that as well. So it's interesting to note that the revision process has already begun. Not long ago, a History News Network poll found 61% of historians ranked Bush the worst president in history. Apparently they have not studied James Buchanan recently. And more recently, Jonathan Rauch, writing in National Review, argued that Bush will probably end up in the, quote, middling ranks of presidents. And even Fareed Zakaria, in a Newsweek piece entitled What Bush Got Right, argued that much of the criticism leveled at the president's war policy is directed at his earlier policies. The policy the administration is currently pursuing, he wrote, is less vulnerable to easy attacks. So in the span of about a year or 18 months, you already see some movement in how people are viewing the Bush presidency. And I suspect that there'll continue to be movement both back and forth over the years to come. And again, as people begin to focus more on the context, I think that will shed light on some of the contents of his decisions. Now let's talk about those decisions, and let's talk about the context as well. Again, to go back to Churchill, he joked that democracy was the worst form of government, except for every other government ever tried. I think there's a similar dynamic at play here in the sense that these were unprecedented times, they were unprecedented challenges, and there was no obvious way to go forward. And so part of the debate that I think the Bush defenders are going to put forward in the court of history in the coming years is the fact that there were no easy choices. There were no obvious solutions. There were no clear-cut paths. He was charting his own course. And he had to do so given the situation that he inherited, or rather came upon him in September of 2001. So I think if you look at the Bush presidency in that sense, it looks a little different. I mean, it's obviously people can debate decisions and mistakes that were made, but to go beyond that and to look at the context he was living in and the fact it was a whole new world, in some ways much like Harry Truman really inventing the whole construct for fighting the Cold War, this was something similar, that Bush was trying to create a whole new infrastructure for fighting a war on terror, which had never been done before. So I think it's helpful to go back in time, if we're looking at context, to look at the entire context and to look at how the president was viewed before this whole new world came upon him in September of 2001. The historian Forrest McDonald has argued that the Founding Fathers, drawing upon the example of the British, established two job descriptions for the president, both head of state and chief political leader. Now in England, as we all know, these jobs are performed by different people. The Queen does the head of state job, the Prime Minister does the politics. But here in the U.S., the president has to do both. And this creates a unique tension as the head of state seeks to unite, while sometimes he has to be the chief political leader as well. I think if I were to use Professor McDonald's work, I would describe the early days of the Bush presidency as a head of state presidency. He very much, coming after the Florida recount, was trying to heal wounds, trying to soothe the bitterness, and trying to bring people together. And again, this is completely forgotten in our memory already. We forget those first 9 months. But it's interesting to go back and look at what the media was saying from January of 2001 through August of 2001. Very different coverage than you might imagine. 1 month into the Bush presidency, columnist Richard Cohen wrote in the Washington Post of the new president, quote, "He wades into groups of Democrats, patting them on the back, bestowing nicknames on them, and proving, as I had always feared, that he is impossible to dislike. I hate people I can't hate," end quote. Now, a passing glance at a more recent Cohen column and you'll see that he no longer suffers from that problem. He's very critical of the president. So what happened? What happened to the head of state president? Well, what happened was September 11th. And again, his presidency changed forever overnight, and there was simply no guidebook for him in what to do. But it's interesting that some of the perceived bitterness and divisiveness of the later years we associate with, say, the second term of the Bush years, a lot of those seeds were there in the early days of 9/11. In fact, almost from the time 9/11 began, I mean, we tend to think back on that time as sort of a period of national unity, and for the most part it was, but you already saw right away a lot of people criticizing the immediate handling of 9/11. People talking about him reading books to children and his plane being diverted to Nebraska, and he wasn't on the scene like Rudy or Rumsfeld. Al Hunt, no less a credible journalist, made the criticism in one of his columns at the time that he simply he had something to learn from Giuliani or Rumsfeld in these cases. So from the very beginning, he was already a president who was being criticized even at the beginning. But regardless, he accepted the wartime president's burden. He knew he would sometimes have to fight divisive battles, as he in fact did. And the soft tone of the first 8 months gave way to hard choices and tough realities. This began in Congress, where the president began fighting important legislative battles. And he would say that this started with providing insurance for the airline industry, creating the whole new counterterrorism infrastructure, and yet even while planning and executing the Afghan campaign, he would probably remind us that he visited a mosque to promote tolerance and created Freedom Corps to promote service. A year later, this is very interesting, that faced with increasing pressure from Congress to create a cabinet-level department for Homeland Security, the president had resisted this call for some time. He reconsidered and decided it made sense, and essentially accepted the Democratic plan. And the Homeland Security Act, along with the counterterrorism measures like the Patriot Act, produced what I think the president is probably going to argue for years to come was his greatest achievement, which was no domestic terrorist attacks since 9/11. It is interesting, the Homeland Security Act in particular, that sort of goes against, again, the image that the pundits have today of this sort of go-it-alone president. I mean, he essentially gave in and took the Democrats' idea from them. So I think collectively, all of these steps show that in the early days, here was a man being tested under fire, trying to fight a difficult war, trying to enlist allies, and trying to find the best way forward when there was no obvious path for him. And I think if you look at the 2002 November elections, Bush at that point had succeeded in restoring people's trust and confidence after the 9/11 attacks. And if the war on terror had ended sometime in early 2003, I think this probably would have been a fairly popular president the remainder of his administration. But like Lincoln and Roosevelt, this president would argue that he was a prerogative president, that he had to lead boldly in challenging times. And he would believe that, as I said earlier, he was living in a whole new world. This is his quote to Katie Couric a couple of years ago. "September 11th affected my thinking. It basically changed my attitude about the world. And I resolved around that time that I would do everything I can to protect the American people." So the president decided that America, after 9/11, couldn't be on defense and couldn't wait for another terrorist attack. He saw what terrorists could do with planes. He didn't want to see what they could do with something more lethal. And so even though Saddam and Al-Qaeda were different beasts, in his view, they were both deadly animals who threatened the country, and he decided to do something about it. So the challenge was Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and if he was close to acquiring weapons of mass destruction, as intelligence agencies all across the world confirmed, how could he allow that to happen given what had just happened a couple of years before at 9/11? And so he decided he couldn't allow this to happen, and by the way, so did most members of Congress, most members of the UN, and most Americans. And it's interesting to go back again and think about what was actually being said and discussed at the time. Having studied the very same intelligence in 2003, this is how the senior senator from Delaware described it, Joe Biden. He said, "Saddam is a long-term threat and a short-term threat to our national security. We have no choice but to eliminate the threat." That's a really nice description of what Bush himself would describe as the Bush Doctrine, that there was simply no choice to go ahead and to do this.